The incubation period in the wild is about 33 days, with about 60 to 80% of the eggs hatching. The excellent care given by the zoo staff hatched over 90% of the eggs. We have birds. Now what do? We use 3 different methods to rear and release as many birds as possible into the wild. Captive parent rearing, where captive swans largely dependent on humans for food were left alone to nest and raise young. Captive rearing, where birds raised for 23 months at semi-wild, fenced sites, then released at selected sites in northern Wisconsin. And decoy rearing, which used a life-size model of a swan manipulated by University of Wisconsin interns in float tubes to lead cygnets around a marsh. In captive parent rearing, swans who had had their wings clipped and were residents of artificial ponds on the grounds of corporate facilities were encouraged to nest and raise their own cygnets. At 10 months of age, those cygnets were then released into the wild.
But back in 1991, they were looking for sites that would support a mating pair of trumpeter swans. They came out here, looked at our lake with the area that it covered, the 15 acres. They thought it was a good place to try, put a pair of birds out here and see what would happen. And then after we built the nesting platform, we built the feeder, we got things going. It was in the winter time that they delivered the birds. By that first spring, by April and May, and we were fortunate enough to, I believe at that time, have a cluster of eggs, of 5 eggs, and we had 2 that hatched.
And at 10 months of age, those city cygnets were taken from a pond next to the Illinois Tollway and released into the wilds of northern Wisconsin. The captive rearing method involved a different approach. When the cygnets that had been hatched from the Alaskan eggs reached 1 to 3 weeks of age, they were taken from the Milwaukee County Zoo and moved to an overwintering site owned by another corporate partner, General Electric Medical Systems near Pewaukee, Wisconsin.
When Medical Systems moved their world headquarters to this Waukesha site in 1974, and this area was originally wetland and it was ultimately drained for farming. One of the things that we wanted to do is to give something back to the community. When the DNR presented the opportunity to partner on the Trumpeter Swan program, we thought that was an excellent program, and the pond just happened to meet the needs of the department for the swans, and it was a great opportunity for us. It allowed Medical Systems to demonstrate to the community that we were concerned about protecting the environment. This is a very visible sign of our commitment to protecting the environment.
Those birds stayed at GE until they were 23 months old. Then, biologists paired unrelated birds, gave them a coated neck collar to allow for identification during migration, banded them with a U.S. Fish and Wildlife leg band, and released them at selected marsh sites. But not just any old marsh site would do.
But another aspect was determining what the habitat needs were of swans, what they used the habitat for, what they needed for nesting, what they needed for food, and then selecting sites for release that would fit those requirements. Hopefully, so we'd release birds in sites that would actually be suitable for nesting in eventually.
Let's see, someplace suitable for nesting. How about this one? Sedge Marsh, 5 to 150 acres. Quiet, private, unlimited access to pondweeds and emergent vegetation. Perfect for takeoffs and landings. Sounds a lot like a place called Crex Meadows.
We picked it because it's perfect in all ways for that sort of thing. I mean, it's remote, they have wonderful wetland areas, there isn't a lot of hunting pressure, there isn't a lot of history of lead poisoning, and so I think Crex has remained the best site for swans, and that's not an accident, that's why we picked it originally.
Crex Meadows would be the backdrop for the third technique, decoy rearing. Begin the process with 1 part instinct, add 2 parts imitation, a dash of drama, some special effects, and voila, a recipe for success in raising swans. The master chef was Becky Abel.
The critical part with imprinting is this movement part. The birds bond to whatever it is. We immediately started running the decoy back and forth. We had it attached to a pulley system. We would pull the pulley back and forth and it would play this follow me call and the cygnets would run along after it. And we did this for the first 3 to 5 days after they hatched to make sure that the bonding had taken place. And then we whisked them off to the wetlands and raised them as we did. We were in floating blinds, which were made up of a fisherman's float tube, camouflage. Over the top of it came a blind, and then I would be wearing chest waders. Then each day I would float up to the cage, pull the decoy out of the cage, and the birds would all follow along behind. And I would take them to good feeding areas, and they would eat, and then we would take them over to a safe loaf site, usually a wide open, flat, dry area, put the decoy up on land, and the cygnets would all climb up behind it and preen for an hour or two, go to sleep, and then when they woke up, we'd go pull it back in and do the whole thing over again. We used the decoy to control their behavior and to get them in and out of the cage at night and to teach them about life on the wetland. At the same time, what they were doing is imprinting on an area and attaching themselves to an area.
But wood birds that had been raised by, or more accurately, had modeled their behavior after a painted puppet ever migrate, leaving that parental surrogate behind? It was scary, and there were skeptics.
People said birds wouldn't migrate. I mean, some of the critics said birds won't migrate if they don't have a parent, or they'll wander around and just die. You know, we were willing to let them wander around and see what they did. That was our attitude. Let them go, see what they do, and learn from them, and hopefully they're, despite the attrition that's going to come, you know, eventually they'll find a way.
The first year, the ducks had left, the geese had left, literally every wetland had frozen up and the swans were still there. We thought they were never going to leave and that, you know, maybe all these naysayers were right, and then they showed up in Texas.
Despite all the obstacles and the naysayers, the swans did come back. Some met and paired up on their own. Some marriages were arranged when the birds were released, but when they went on to nest, none of that mattered.
Well, we had decoy-reared birds nesting with decoy-reared birds, captive-reared birds breeding with decoy-reared birds, captive-reared birds breeding with other captive-reared birds, and so forth. In total, by 1998, we had released 384 birds into the wild through our different techniques. And it was after 1998 that our population jumped from 18 breeding pairs to nearly 100 in only 8 years.